Yes. So this is the third seminar in a series of sessions dedicated to theorizing from qualitative data. And in particular, what we're going to do today, we will focus on persuading, how to persuade the reviewers that your study provided a significant novel theoretical contribution. And to do that, you have to prepare the ground. And that's why we will not talk, not focus only on the discussion, but we will see how you prepare the ground for a theoretical contribution already by framing the paper in an appropriate way. Before we do that, you can see, start presentation. Yes. Before we do that, usual disclaimer. This is not the only way to frame a study, structure your discussion, or claim a theoretical contribution. What I'm going to present is what I think has worked for me in the past. But there are many ways to frame a study. There are many ways to structure your discussion section. And sometimes I do things slightly differently or quite differently from what I'm going to present today. But it's a place to start, as usual. Then you can take it as a place to start and see if it works for you. Also, this is what has worked in certain journals. It has worked for me in AMJ in the past. It doesn't mean that all journals are receptive of the same style, the same way of framing your study, the same way of constructing argument about the potential contribution. So again, always keep in mind that the target journal will probably make a difference in how to adjust what you hear today to the expectations and the conventions of the particular community that revolves around that journal. So disclaimer, what I'm going to present makes sense if you're doing a case study research or grounded theory, qualitative research more generally, but not all kinds of qualitative research, depending on the ontological and epistemological assumptions behind your study. Some of what I'm going to present today may be considered not so appropriate by some reviewers. So again, always be conscious, be mindful of what you're doing, and make sure that however you structure your arguments and however you frame your study is consistent with the general philosophical assumptions behind your methodology. So today we're going to address three critical issues when theorizing from qualitative data. And one of them we already talked about it and mentioned something. You will see that I will go back and retrieve some of the content that we introduced in the first or in the second webinar, and some will be new to this particular session. So the first problem is how to frame your study, because you say, well, mine is a case study, but the question is, what is this a case of? And this is important because you need to establish the scope within which you can generalize, you can transfer the insights that you learn from the study. Remember, the purpose of a study is not to take some existing knowledge and apply it to understand a particular setting, a particular event, or a particular organization. The purpose is to study a particular organization to see if you can learn something more general about how people interact, how organizations function, whatever your research question is. So your paper will be published not because it takes a well-established theory and applied skillfully, cleverly to a particular empirical phenomenon, but because it uses an empirical phenomenon to generate some more general insight that can help us understand better something else in the world. A theory of transferability or generalizability, if you want to borrow from a more positivistic language. So in order to establish the transferability of your insights, it is important to define the boundaries. And this is what we do when we frame our study. And we will get back to that in a second. The second problem, and we already addressed this to some extent in webinar 1, is how to move from a rich, accurate description of your findings, what you observed empirically, to a theorization of these findings, an explanation in more general terms that can be considered an insight that you could then transfer and use to understand some other part of the world. Remember the distinction between a historical explanation, an explanation of what happened in a particular circumstance because of a unique set of conditions and events, versus a theoretical explanation, an explanation that brings out the mechanisms, the deeper relationships that shape what happened in that particular case, and that may make similar things happening in similar circumstances. Okay. Finally, another issue is to, once you have properly defined the boundaries of generalizability, once you have properly produced some theoretical explanations that could be plausibly extended to within these particular boundaries, then the next step is to persuade your reviewers that these insights that you have produced are novel and significant. Hence, they deserve publication in very good journal. Okay. So what we're going to do today, first, we will reflect on how to frame your study appropriately in order to establish the boundaries within which you claim generalizability/transferability of your findings. We will, and I thought I had disconnected that phone, and yet it rings anyway. We will reflect on how to claim this generalizability and transferability when then discussing your insights. And it looks like my mother is not going to answer, but they will go tired of and finally, how to actually structure your discussion sections. Okay, what do I write in the discussion section? How do I present my novel insights in a way that highlights their novelty and that somehow persuades the reviewers to accept these statements as important, significant, interesting, deserving publication. Okay. Now, to do that, I am going to draw on a particular experience, a paper that was published a couple of years ago, together with Alessandro Giudici, former colleague at CAS, who was a PhD student at Cranfield, and this was drawn by his PhD dissertation. Patrick Reinmoeller was the supervisor of Alessandro at Cranfield, and I joined the team later when Alessandro and I met when he moved to CAS. And reflecting on what we did, especially in the last round of revision, to persuade reviewers that we had some interesting theoretical insights that deserve publication in the Italian Management Journal, that reflecting on how we approach this was the first inspiration for the presentation that you see today. Like, realizing that I had learned so much in doing that and trying to rationalize it, and I thought that it deserved to be rationalized in a way. Because as we were discussing, as we were thinking about how to approach things, I had some of these enlightening reflections. Is okay, let's try to structure this into a presentation that helps me share what I think of. And this is what I'm going to share with you today. So this paper drew on the doctoral dissertation of Alessandro. It went through 3 rounds of reviews at the Academic Management Journal, and it was eventually accepted by the end of the final acceptance was somehow at the end of 2017. And what I'm going to share with you today is the last revision, the one that really made a difference in terms of claiming a theoretical contribution. Up until then, the reviewers were like, great study, rich, insightful, very detailed description, very solid methodology, but, as the editor wrote in the second letter, the most notable obstacle to publication is your theoretical contributions. The most significant, or rather the absence. The most significant task is front of you to boast of your contribution. Reviewer 1, I'm still struggling with the ultimate contribution of your paper and the broader implications of your work. I'm sure you have an interesting story, but I'm not sure yet about what your story is. Despite the more explicit discussion in this vice versa, I'm still a bit underwhelmed with the stated and active contributions of your study. So it seems to be clear, like they didn't quite see a very a strong, clear, convincing theoretical contribution. Great empirical story, but what are we learning here really? Also, they were mentioning, well, maybe your arguments are a little narrow. Why does it matter to study a very specific instance of external source and just one of the three components of dynamic capabilities? I will discuss this later in more details. Now, they were saying, you're framing this narrow, you're talking to a very specific audience. You have a chance to tell a bigger theoretical story, which is what OMJ really wants. Another reviewer was saying, well, what your discussion of the model is really just a summary of the findings. You're not really explaining what you learned, you're just summarizing your observations. But also, this is a very interesting case, but what is this a case of? What can we learn that is applicable to other contexts? What is the theoretical generalizability? We need to establish more clear boundary conditions for our model. And this was so it was very clear that this was the remaining key issue that had to be addressed. And so we started to think, okay, why do we have this problem? Why are they saying what do these objections come from? And as we reread the introduction, we realized that, well, the paper at the time, before the final revision, had a relatively narrow framing around dynamic capabilities. Dynamic capabilities, it's a well-known concept, but there's not many people out there that study dynamic capabilities. And essentially, the framing was, we were saying, there's a lot of research on dynamic capabilities, mostly about internal capabilities. There's an article where T says there may be external dynamic capabilities, but that's all that there is. And so we decided to study this organization as an example of dynamic capabilities. And actually, we demonstrate that, yes, external dynamic capabilities exist. It was like a bit of a weak argument. When reflecting on our observations, when discussing our empirical observations, when at the time where reviewers were expecting us to theorize what we saw, actually that section started by saying, we will summarize. That's why reviewer number 2 is saying this is a summary and not a discussion or not a theorization. We were actually saying we will summarize, and then we were really describing historical observations in summary, rather than theorizing the mechanisms. After having presented all the findings, we were just describing them again in a summary way, telling again what happened, but not explaining why it happened. And that's why it's saying, what's the theory here? What are we learning more generally? Finally, it wasn't clear, like, hey, this B2B match, this particular matchmaking organization, whose job is to help entrepreneurs get in touch with one another, potential suppliers, potential customers, potential partners. What is this a case of? You say that it's an example of dynamic capabilities that can also be external, but you call it a supporting organization. But what is this? And so we thought, well, the first thing to do was really to revisit the frame. We decided to start from the very beginning and say the dynamic capabilities, that doesn't fly as a frame. They don't seem to like the idea of this being a study of dynamic capabilities. We need to find some bigger framing that speaks to a bigger audience, but at the same time is more clearly related to our paper. Now let's take a step back. What does framing mean? Framing means establishing right away what the particular case you study is a case of. The particular organization or the particular event, the particular process is a case of like, what is this an instance of? What kind of general phenomenon is this a specific instance of? And this is really a problem of categorization. So on the one hand, it means asking yourself the question, what type of organization or organizational phenomenon did we study? So that we can transfer what we learned to other similar cases. Was this a study of business matchmakers? So that we transfer our understandings only to other business matchmakers? That would have been a narrow frame. Is this a case of supporting organizations? Okay, but what are they? What characterizes supporting organizations? Or this is a case of external dynamic capability. Like, whoa, that seems to be a very broad concept, and we have studied a very specific organization. The next question then is, how is this case different from apparently similar organizations or organizational phenomena in ways that prevent us from transferring their findings? Assuming that there are other types of supporting organizations, can I transfer what I learned from a business matchmakers to whatever else it may be? Or all external dynamic capabilities functioning pretty much like we saw them functioning in a business matchmaker? These are crucial questions. These are crucial questions that establish the extent to which you can transfer what you've learned in your particular case to a more general phenomenon. Okay, so remember what I said earlier. The idea of research, ideally, one could argue, and again, this is a philosophical question, but let's assume that the purpose of our research is to help us understand more general organizational phenomena. We don't assume whether these phenomena exist out there, they are socially constructed. Let's keep that aside. But the idea, I think that we can all agree that, at least pragmatically speaking, to get published in most academic journals, you need to persuade reviewers that your study helps us understand a more general organizational phenomenon. An organizational phenomenon that in a community is examined, debated, analyzed, investigated within the lenses of a particular theory. Theory being a set of constructs, concepts, and stated relationship among concepts that we use as scholars in order to conceptualize and understand a particular phenomenon out there, and again, out there in brackets. Okay. Now, to do that, we study a specific empirical setting. We select one site, one specific site, one specific organization, one specific event, or specific industry, field, or whatever, in order to understand and generate insight that can enrich then our theory, our conceptualization, our shared conceptualization of this phenomenon. Now, to do this, this is what the theoretical contribution is about. No? Is about learning something from an empirical setting that somehow increases my theoretical understanding of a phenomenon. Now, in order to do this, I need to connect this particular manifestation, to have persuasive arguments that connect this specific setting to an organizational theory. And this is what the framing does, is a persuasive, reasonable conceptualization of our setting that justifies the fact that then the insights that we generate from this setting can be linked to a broader theory of organization. I hope this is clear, but we will, at the end of the framing, there will be space for some questions, but hopefully it will be clearer once I make a couple of examples. So, at the time, before the last round, the framing was pretty much like this. So we say, there is a literature out there on dynamic capabilities that investigates how firms innovate systematically. It's one of the theoretical lenses that people use to understand this more general phenomenon, the capacity of firms to innovate systematically and continuously. Now, we are studying B2B Match, a matchmaking organization in Italy, that belong to the more general category of business matchmakers. It's a type of organization. And we argue that business matchmakers are supporting organizations. We are less clear at the time in the paper about what are other supporting organizations, perhaps incubators. We don't know. It's not very clear. These supporting organizations, we argue, are an example of external capabilities. So presumably there are other external capabilities, but we're not very clear about what they are. Now, then again, when we talk about external capabilities, we oppose them to internal capabilities. That's where most research is on. But then we really study sensing capabilities, but we know that dynamic capabilities are also seizing and transforming. It's a bit of a mess. So it was kind of difficult for reviewers to understand exactly, but what are we learning something about really? Now, you see now why it was difficult for them to see clear boundaries of transferability or generalizability. So we said, okay, we need to do that. And then building on a suggestion from one of the reviewers, we say, look, there is there's an academic conversation out there that looks at how firms in innovation networks are coordinated, and looks at it through the lenses of something that is called orchestration. And there are other ways in which you can look at coordination of innovation networks. We decided to pick this one because this is the academic conversation that we want to join, the academic debate that we want to enrich, that we want to contribute. Now, this literature on orchestration has mostly focused on what we could call closed system orchestration. Hub firms, R&D consortia, where the orchestrator centralizes and controls very closely the flow of the innovation. But actually, we've known from recent research that there are other types. There's another type of orchestration that we call open system, where the idea here is not to closely coordinate, control, and manage a network of contributors to a single focused innovation network, but to facilitate the interaction among a dispersed network of firms and entrepreneurs that then stimulate dispersed venturing rather than a centralized innovation program. We argue that B2B match, which is a business matchmaker, is a type of organization where open system orchestration takes place, along with other organizations like agencies and incubators. You see, now it becomes simpler. We're saying we're studying B2B match as a business matchmaker, arguing that business matchmakers, along with other type of organizations, and tell you what they are, within these organizations, these organizations perform what we call open system orchestration, one type of orchestration that we know very well. So you see how we managed to get the sweet spot between a very broad framing. We use B2B match to study orchestration, and a very narrow framing. We study B2B match to study business matchmakers. If we had framed the study in terms of business matchmakers, thanks to our study, now we know more about business matchmaking. AMJ would have never published, because it's something very narrow, specialized for journal business venture. But a broader framing in orchestration, people would have said, well, but there are other types of orchestration. That's what you learn about B2B match apply to hub firms or R&D consortia. Probably not. So you see, open system orchestration is a sufficiently broad framing to be appealing, but not too broad so that it is questionable whether we can really transfer anything we've learned to that level of categorization. Okay. We also associated this new framing with a table that clearly specifies the characteristics of closed system orchestration versus open system orchestration. And then it clarifies the common characteristics of organizations that perform open system orchestration and organizations that perform closed system orchestration. And it helps us classify past literature. And this defines the phenomenon. But then the question is, we don't know what happens because we know a lot about how closed system orchestration is performed. We know much less about how open system orchestration is performed. Okay, so that was a framing that was much clearer for reviewers to understand and made more sense to them. By the way, this literature map, I've always found it very useful when it comes to framing because it clearly positions yourself within the literature. And I do it in a lot of papers. I try to have something like this because if you're mapping the literature in an interesting and novel way already in the literature review, your reviewers are like, oh, okay, this is page 5, and I've already learned something interesting from this paper. I haven't even got to the empirical part, and I've already learned something interesting. The feeling of added value is already there. This is an example from my paper with Mike and Schultz, where we introduced the idea in organizational identity. There's a social actor perspective and social constructionist perspective. This was introduced in the literature review, and that paper is mostly cited for this thing. So even before getting to the empirical part, we had something that reviewers were like, oh, okay, this is an interesting distinction. I've already learned something. And sometimes, this is another example from a paper that was published on AMJ in 2012, where we distinguish retrospective sense making from prospective sense making, and say ours is a study of prospective sense making. And again, it's right there in the introduction. We don't have a map, but we use the two columns to build the review of the literature. Essentially, we took that text, we put it one above the other, and then we just wrote if you see the structure of the literature review, it's really the structure of this map. Okay, there's a question. Shall we have a question? Somebody read. Malika, yes.
Hi, thanks a lot, David. So I have a quick question about this mapping of the literature. Yes. Can you just talk a little bit about the process you follow? Is it after you constructed your data structure, that you talked about, and so you talked about, how once we have a data structure and a figure, like a sort of a framework, then we can start writing. Do you actually iteratively construct this mapping of the literature as you start your writing, or can you just give us a little bit background and the process you follow? Because I find it extraordinarily helpful and useful, and I think this is one of your sort of this amazing creative craft that we can all learn from. Thank you.
So no, that's a good question. But in my case, at least, it is largely disconnected from the analysis. Or if it is, I'm not aware of it. To me, it's more like, wait a second. These people out there are using the same word to talk about different things. Or they talk about the same things, but in different ways. Let's clarify things. This was, for instance, all the papers on sense making, by the time we were writing this paper, all those papers talk about sense making as a general phenomenon, but they were really looking at very different events. And some were looking at sense making in strategy formulation, and some were looking at sense making as what's going on here when a fire erupts or a nuclear nuclear power station blows up. But this is different stuff. And so it was an effort to make sense, to introduce some order and say, okay, how are these things different? And it's a categorization effort. Like why are people calling all of this in the same way? What are the common features? But why do I have a feeling that they're talking about different things? What are the differences in what they study, in how the assumptions under which they study things? So it's really like engaging deeply with the literature and going beyond okay, if everybody calls it the same way, let's call it in the same way. It's like, oh yeah, there are different views out there, and let's acknowledge these, and let's these different views, and let's position our paper more clearly within these differences. I think that, no, this was already going back to, did I answer your question?
So yeah, so I kind of, what I understood is that you kind of step back from the data and sort of reflect on it to, no?
Sometimes, yes. So to be honest, sometimes this awareness of this latent, hidden structure in the literature, it emerges between during the first revision, and perhaps because it's pushed by. Sometimes it's pushed by the reviewer. Sometimes it's like the more you go into the data or in the literature, the more finally you get this enlightenment. But
yeah, thank you. No,
no problem. We have two questions, and I would just keep these two and then move on, so that maybe for once we manage to finish in 90 minutes. Ankita.
Hello, Professor. When you are actually reviewing your framing totally in this paper as you described, does it also mean that the coding and the analysis of the and the presentation of the analysis would also change? Because a lot of times the coding and analysis is linked to the framing of the paper.
You will see that it didn't. It may. In this case, it didn't radically change. It was just a matter of properly framing.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No problem. Ravikar? You're muted.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I just want to be clear, because you say about the role of literature that help you to position your research.
Yes.
But I also have another set of literature that I use reconfiguration to shape my data in order to analyze my data. So after the finding, do I need to compare with the main set of my literature that I grounded, that I find my research gap, and the one with the reconfiguration?
So essentially what you're saying is that as you analyze data, it is possible that you have a better view of of problems with the literature, and that your emergent findings will lead you to alter the assumption. I think like the literature is partly wrong. If that's the case, that's what it should be, and we'll talk about that in the third part of the presentation today.
Okay, maybe I will ask later on, because after that part,
Hold that thought, because maybe you'll see, because maybe we will address this later on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Just to give you another example, this is from a work in progress. I have a former student of mine that studied architects in a Boston firm, and the idea was to study how they reformulate the problems that they face. And an initial framing was, this is a study of problem solving. And problem solving being the theory that scholars use to understand the more general phenomenon of how people search for a course of action to address some needs. Then we thought, like, okay, but problem solving is a very broad concept. We know that there are different types of problems, different types of, different ways to go about problems. So we thought, well, maybe this is not problem solving in general. It's problem solving when goals are unclear. In some cases, the goals are very clear, or the problem is restructured, and that's not what happened in these architectural firms. What made them, what they did was what they did because first, before they could design a building, they had to understand better what were really the goals of the various stakeholders involved. So the particular architects that she could have studied this as an example of architectural projects, but it would be a narrow frame. The study of this architectural firm helped us understand better how architects approach their job. This may be interesting for a specialized journal in, I don't know, the creative industries. Framing it as problem solving would have been too broad. There are different types of problem solving. So we had to find something that was broad enough to be interesting for AMJ, ASQ, or science, but at the same time not too narrow, but at the same not too broad, so that people can say, you know what, you're claiming too much, you're overstretching from your setting. And then we started thinking, okay, what other types of settings are out there where you have unclear goals? And maybe multi-stakeholder initiatives. How about managers? Are their goals they face clear, unclear? Maybe they are clear just because there's a whole infrastructure that somehow clarifies their goals in terms of, or they can always go back to profitability and market share or revenues, but they are really, I don't know, there's a question mark there, because this is still a work in progress. So, and framing is not always simple, straightforward. You try different ways of categorizing your setting, and sometimes different framing may be appropriate depending on the question. So think about if you were in the natural world and you want to study wolves, you study a pack of wolves. Like, what have you studied? What is this a case of? Well, it depends on if you're interested in studying their hunting techniques, that this is a case of carnivore pack hunters. If you're studying parental cares, this may be a case of mammals. Or if you're studying some metabolical processes, may be a case of animals versus plants. A broader or a narrower categorization of this particular setting may be more or less appropriate depending on the particular question. I don't know if this helped or is confusing. Anyway, so when it comes to thinking about your own stuff, you should always ask yourself, what is the general phenomenon? What is your research? What is this a case of? And what is the highest level of abstraction that you can possibly use to frame this? I studied change. I studied organizations. I studied competition. What is a minimal descriptive label? What kind of organization? What kind of change? What kind of... And then you have to find a sweet spot. A broad but defensible categorization. Broad, hence appealing to generalist journals, but defensible. Something that, yeah, you can plausibly claim that what you have learned from your particular setting applies to this. How do you do that? So that, two more bits and pieces. To do that, you have to ask yourself, what are similar cases, manifestation of the same phenomenon? And what cases appear similar, but if you think about it, are really different types, different structural relationships, for instance. In your organizations, most employees were volunteers, so that probably wouldn't apply to organizations where employees are hired, salaried, or constraints and affordances. Some organizations operate in highly controlled, regulated environments, others do not. Some organizations need to be profitable to survive. Non-profit organizations, they need to pursue legitimate, appealing goals. Different cultural contexts may make what you learn from a particular occupation or a particular country not transferable to another occupation. So you see, these are the kind of questions that you ask yourself. What would be similar? What would be, what could I possibly transfer my insights to? And what is really different so that I cannot really transfer my answer there because of some fundamental difference. And these are just examples of the particular differences. And it's really a process, as I said, you should start with a high-level abstract conceptualization, and then compare with other empirical manifestations. And so if you study and it says, well, this is about orchestration, okay, but it's probably something, this is a bit too broad. What are other organizations where orchestration takes place? Matchmakers, incubators, hub firms. Are they, which ones are similar and which ones are different? Incubators, they kind of look like what we do. Hub firms, probably not. Okay, why? What are the features that make other organizations in the general category similar or different? And then find this minimum common theoretical denominator, the features that distinguish your case from some empirical manifestations that are common to others. Remember the table 1 has orchestration, closed system orchestration, and open system orchestration. Problem formulation revolves around here. And then you problematize. You compare this tentative framing, some sweet spot between high-level abstraction and very descriptive labeling, with what we already know about this, and say, okay, why can't we use general theories of orchestration, problem solving, or so to explain this? Because if we can use more general theories of change to explain and understand what you studied, then there's not much novelty there. Yeah, but this is a particular case. Yeah, but if you can use general theories to explain the particular ones, you don't need to focus on particular cases. You need to focus on particular cases if you cannot explain them with the general theories. If you can explain the particular phenomenon with the general theory, explaining is weak. But you say, look, we can't explain business matchmaking based on general theories of orchestration we have, because those theories came from a study of closed system orchestration. This is open system. How much do we really know about this? Well, we don't know much, actually, and we need to learn how this thing happened because it's different, and those general theories do not apply. And if we don't know much, like, why did past studies overlook this aspect? It wasn't very visible, was more difficult to study. They didn't acknowledge this distinction, was not important. Now, why? And why is it important to understand this better? Why now? You see, this is a step-by-step guide to problematizing the literature in a way that justifies your study and creates the ground for your theoretical contribution. It pushes reviewers to think about, oh, there's a need to know more about this. And so in the introduction, we started very broad and said, well, research shows that often innovation takes place in distributed networks. And past researchers looked at this through the lenses of orchestration, but using the technique that Golden did a lot to find out synthesized coherence, there are a bunch of studies that show that there are organizational forms that perform some kind of orchestration, but it's not the type of orchestration that has been theorized by prior studies that focused instead on hub firms and R&D consortia. And learning more about this is important because if you go and look at the paper, we say, well, these kind of organizations move a lot of money. They are essential for the success and failure of a lot of entrepreneurial ventures. We give them some hard data that say, well, we're talking about thousands of organizations that mobilize millions and millions of dollars and pounds and euros, and we just don't know how they work. We need to learn more. It's reasonable. And then dynamic capabilities really came in as in the end, to do this, we will look at it through the lens of dynamic capability. And it remained, but you will realize that in the end, it was not really, and we kept it in because one of the reviewers seemed to be really liking this and investing in this, and actually that you can do that, but it was no longer the primary framing. So the review of the literature opened with this map and saying, well, there's closed and there's open system, and then problematizing the literature and showing that there's a need for more, for a deeper understanding of this particular this particular thing. Now, if you want, now there's a chance for a couple of questions. I hope this was clear. I know it's not easy, but this is the closest thing that I came up with when it comes to explaining how I come up with the frame. To me, it comes natural, and it's something that I look at the papers and this framing doesn't quite work. Try this framing. This, I don't know if it made sense to you. But if there are no questions, we can move on and look at how we address the second issue, like strengthening theory development. And I think that seems to be what we're going to do. Now, the grounded model before the last revision was this. The grounded model that we submitted was this. Not very different. It was, we altered some labels, we cleaned up a little, but we didn't quite transform the analysis, because that already captured pretty much what was going on there, and it was just a matter of articulating better the mechanisms and linking it more explicitly with the frame. So what did we do? We used the general theory of entrepreneurship to theorize the efforts. So the idea was, if open system orchestration is about supporting dispersed entrepreneurial ventures, then we need to unpack the mechanisms through which open system orchestration does that. And to do that, we need a general theory of how entrepreneurship happens, so that we can explain how those things that P2D match do help trigger those mechanisms that eventually lead to an intensification of entrepreneurial ventures within them. Okay. Remember the idea of retroduction that we introduced from the first webinar. We already went through this. Research question, the idea that you have a research question that leads to some empirical observations, some sequences, progressions, associations, and that you need to move from this empirical observation, this descriptive observation of what happened, what you saw happening, to a more general, non-idiosyncratic explanation, a general theoretical account. And how you do that? You do it by bringing in some general theory that helps you unpack the mechanisms through which you can explain the particular patterns, the particular regularities that you observe. We went through this paper already a few weeks ago. Remember when I told you how one of the empirical observations, the idea of providing referrals to and arranging the location of stands to facilitate in perhaps chance meetings or somehow arranged meetings. How did this lead to intensification of entrepreneurial, dispersed entrepreneurial innovation? We explained this through the idea that entrepreneurial innovation is based on a novel combinations of complementary resources. People have dispersed resources and dispersed information, and so orchestrators help this dispersed entrepreneurial innovation by creating opportunities for people to meet, increasing the likelihood that people that have potentially complementary resources actually meet, learn about one another, share information, and decide to get together and start a new venture. You see how, to get to this explanation, I need to pass through a more general theory of how entrepreneurial innovation happens. But that was not all. We also articulated cognition and emotion more precisely. Remember that here in this model we talked about cognitive microprocesses, emotional microprocesses. Here we try to articulate a little better assumptions of mutual trustworthiness or enhanced self-awareness, positive emotional experience. So we try to be a little more precise. And then we use empirical observations to exemplify our arguments, not to replace the theoretical explanation. Remember the objection of the reviewers. You summarize, you don't theorize. And here's an example. So here's how we described something before the revision. We found that this orchestration process fostered a collaborative climate that influenced emotional microprocesses that firms experienced when conducting research activities. This was a statement, descriptive statement. And then, so when attending B2B match in 2011, 2013, 2014, we observed firsthand that the procession climate led firms to enjoy their participation, encouraged and incentivized. You see, this is the past tense. Here we are describing what we saw and using what we saw to justify a general statement. After the revision, it was different. Building collaborative engagement is important because it helps diffuse assumptions of mutual trustworthiness among participants. It does so to the extent the majority of members complies with social norms and views the network as a community of potential collaborators, rather than as in trade fairs a mere opportunity to meet potential clients. So we established theoretically some conditions that need to be present for this client. Assumptions of mutual trustworthiness in turn motivate network members to lower relational barriers and to share knowledge and information with more freely, which is essential for the discovery of valuable complementarity. This is all in the present tense. This is an explanation of the mechanisms that are activated for what business makers do to produce certain outcomes. Past tense, present tense. History, description, explanation. This is absolutely important. Okay? So then we used past studies to corroborate these findings and say, look, what we saw is also something that other people saw empirically. These findings resonate with research and other forms of open system orchestrators that highlight the importance of promoting trust to encourage collaboration. For instance, Burkes argues that regional agencies managing industrial clusters, something that we said it's an open system orchestrator, need to conduct activities that build trust. Hurricane and Schilling noted business associations play a highly important role in strengthening and enforcing trust. You see, saying it's not just us that explain that it's not like our argument about trust being important is something that seems to be supported by other studies that, without highlighting this orchestration role, somehow hinted at the importance of trust for this open system orchestrators to do their job well. So don't get it wrong. What I'm saying here is not that you should say, oh, other people in the past saw what we did. Theoretically, you have to emphasize how the empirical observations resonate with other empirical observations in past studies that examine similar cases, so belonging to the same type of organizational phenomenon, but did not acknowledge the same theoretical relevance of these observations. It's like other people did see something similar, but unlike us, they did not recognize the theoretical relevance of this. Because if they did, if the theoretical interpretations are similar, you have a problem. Okay? But otherwise, you can claim some empirical corroboration. I do that all the time, using your new theoretical ideas to reinterpret prior work. Our observations appear corroborated by research on strategy making and organizational change, describing similar processes in other settings. Here we take the new ideas that we introduce, material assemblage, material memory, visual integration, and we say, look, past studies showed examples of material assemblage, example of visual integration. Our framework brings together all these dispersed observations and provides a unifying theoretical account that can explain all of this stuff. In a paper with Charlotte Coutier that I mentioned in the prior seminars. Here, again, we say we're not portraying exactly the same patterns. The case of Alessi seems consistent with the arguments. And then we show how, actually, if we reinterpret what others, well, actually that was me with other colleagues, presented about Alessi, we see something that is consistent with the theory that we are proposing here about how attribute-based claim and relationship-based versus relationship-based claims influence the long-term trajectories of change. So To summarize, how do you theorize your observations in a way that allows you to claim generalizability or transferability? Theorizing, explaining, is essential for what Yin calls analytical generalizability. And this means being able to explain the whole model without ever referring to empirical observations a single time. You need to be able, in a section of your paper, to just explain and say, this is how the model works, and explain it in general terms without ever saying, oh, this is because this is what I saw happen. No, you need to explain the logical connections, the mechanisms, without needing exemplification. You have to define each box, each construct, and theorize each error. This is very important. Every error, like, okay, that means something. It's a relationship. Explain it. Use the present tense to suggest more general applicability. Try not to use the past. The past is the time of description, reporting, historical descriptions. Present is the time of explanation, the tense of explanation. Establish conditions necessary for a certain outcome to occur and explain how your findings satisfy those conditions. This is very important. There's always something that you're trying to explain, or there's often something that you're trying to explain. And how do you know that what you, oops, other questions? No. How do you know that what you saw that organization doing led to that outcome? Well, you establish a priori some conditions that need to happen, and you show how what they did satisfied those conditions. And then point to other studies that you can reinterpret using your theory, or that corroborate your findings by showing similar findings. And that's what transferability is about. Because transferability, Cooper and Lincoln really tell you, transferability is it's really about other scholars reading your work and realizing that that can be useful to understand, to explain what they are interested in. So the burden is on you to be as rich and precise as possible so that they can have a better idea of whether what you saw applies to that particular case. My interpretation of transferability is giving some examples to your reviewers that actually, you know what, you can take these ideas and apply them to other studies, apply them to past research, apply them to other cases that are well known, and can enlighten us, can illuminate something that we wouldn't see before our study and before we produced our findings. Now, when claiming that's something very important. There's a difference between corroboration and novelty. Corroboration of findings. So when claiming corroboration, you need to emphasize similarity with other organizations that belong to the same type. But then you need to emphasize differences from organizations of a different type to claim the novelty of the finding. Okay? Look, there's research about similar organizations that strengthen my claims, that says it's not just what I saw in this particular case, but other empirical settings seem to display similar patterns. But then you have to also argue that what you saw is different from what was previously described about other types of organizations, other types of processes, closed system orchestration versus open system orchestration. Okay, there's a question. Brenda, nice to meet you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you again. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. I just understood that you said similar type of corroboration for similar type of organizations, but in case my unit of analysis is individuals, in this case, for example, women entrepreneurs. So do I compare them to women in organizations or women in academia or something like that?
So you have to ask yourself whether what you saw is really is generalizable or is somehow specific to those particular women. Were you studying only high-tech entrepreneurs? Were they well-educated? Were they entrepreneurs by choice or by accident? Were they coming from a family, from wealthy entrepreneurial families, or were they just thrown into entrepreneurship to make ends meet? So you see, there's always something about your informants that may possibly influence your findings. So the question you have to ask yourself, is there a possibility that I saw what I saw just because of some specific characteristics of my sample, the people I talked to?
Okay.
I think that that's how this idea of similarities and differences affect your particular case.
And would that be, do I increase the sample size for that, or just I say that this is in literature?
Well, I don't know. It really depends. Sometimes you want to increase the sample size so that your statements are applied to a broader population. And sometimes you just narrow down the framing and say, I'm studying female high-tech entrepreneurs. So I make no claims about the experience of female entrepreneurs in traditional industries. My study helps us understand better female entrepreneurs in high-tech.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
So
that makes
it's always a matter of like, how broad do you want to be? How broad can you realistically be? And then finding a frame that is reasonable.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you. That, yeah.
No problem.
Right.
Alicia.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Alicia.
Hi, thank you. I'm asking a question for Katarina because she can, I can't think. So how would you approach theorizing if you have multiple levels of analysis and rich empirical data? Let's say you have the levels of individual, team, organizational, and network. So I think it depends what you want to focus on, but when you have a research, you have a lot of data.
It depends on your research design and your research question. So sometimes when you have multi-level data, the higher level is context, but you're really interested mostly on the micro level, and you use the higher level as context to define the boundaries of generalizability of what you see at lower level. There's a breakout room here. I think it's sometimes you're interested in what happens at macro level, and the micro level is really the drivers of what happens in macro level. I think that the framing needs to be at the level that you want to, where the things you want to explain are happening. You see what I mean? There's always a focus. You are focused primarily on the micro, the meso, the macro, always, often. And that probably should be the focus of the framing.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers
the
question, but I think so. Thank you.
No problem. Martin, and then unless Ibra, do you have any service communication or anything?
Just a question on behalf of one of the participants.
Okay, then Martin, and then.
Thanks, Davide, and thank you for your insights. I could follow most of what you said. One thing I was struggling with is your strong call for using present tense in the theorization.
Yes.
As of my reading of this slide, you always used indicative mood here, and not, we're talking about any potential relationships between constructs. I was thinking in my field, which is accounting, not so much management, but accounting, we always have, or we often have, A may lead to B, so potential relationships.
Yes.
And this is somewhat not what you've done. You've said, okay, A leads to B. Is this a matter of boundary conditions only, or what is your view on this?
So I just casually randomly pick one paragraph. It's not that all my research, all my discussions are written in the indicative, and absolutely not. That just happened to be written in that particular way. Sometimes you are more tentative Sometimes you acknowledge more explicitly that things may happen. But the thing is that then you may want to specify the conditions. Under what conditions is something likely to lead to that? Otherwise, it's a little undetermined. No, so it may happen under some conditions, or what increases or decreases the likelihood that something will happen. And so, and I'm just guilty. Yeah? Every now and then I just use these relatively vague statements, and maybe like it may lead to this. It's like, okay, but really, if we really wanted to be rigorous, we should say a few words about when do you expect this to happen, and why. Because
the message is probably stronger with indicative mood than with potential forms of relationships.
Sometimes it's also a matter of style. Sometimes your reviewers seem to be more comfortable with a certain style. They want to be a little more something that I you see. No, perhaps when you theorize, you may want to be a little more like, this is what I think is happening here. But then when I'm discussing, then probably I am more tentative. And you never use the word demonstrate. It's always suggest, reveal, highlight. And,
okay, thanks.
No problem. Ibra.
So the question is on behalf of Arif, who unfortunately is not able to unmute himself. His question is the framing best driven by phenomenon, e.g. empirical observation, or driven by theory? And if I may also throw in relation to this question, how does this also shape the question, the way you formulate the question?
So the framing has to connect the phenomenon and the theory. Now, if you remember my slide, the framing is what links a phenomenon to a particular theoretical observation, conversation. But it has to be anchored in the phenomenon, because there are different ways in which you can frame a particular study, but they have to fit with the study. If they only fit a theoretical conversation, it means that you're making statements that are not supported by your data. So and in terms of the research question, it may deserve an interesting session in itself. How do you formulate research questions? But I think we will say something in this final part of the session about more about mistakes to avoid when formulating the research question. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Peter?
Hi. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. I was just intrigued. I study a lot around innovation, and it seems to be it has a lot of umbrella constructs where the conceptual clarity is not high. And I think dynamic capabilities is one of those things, where any literature review you read about dynamic capability begins with some sort of declaration that it's impossible to measure and that it's very ephemeral. And therefore, I was just wondering, when you begin, sometimes are there any sort of conceptual areas that you deliberately avoid? I mean, I noticed you went in the example you showed us at the beginning with dynamic capabilities, you pretty much withdrew that after the second and went for something about, asset orchestration or something. Are there a few you think that you could be backwards and forwards with reviewers for years, with everybody having a different interpretation of what the theory actually means?
Well, yes. I'm not sure I would be comfortable telling you my opinion also. No, but I think that to some degree, the framing of a paper is something that, in my experience, it's negotiated with reviewers. You try a framing that seems reasonable to you, and you see how it flies with reviewers, and sometimes they will object, they will They would propose alternative framings. Sometimes you push back. Sometimes you say, hey, that's a great idea, actually, because it is. And so, yes, on occasions, the framings of my paper were the same from the beginning to the end. More often, framings evolve as you try to figure out what reviewers seem to be comfortable accepting, while at the same time remaining truthful to your data. In the end, if they propose something that doesn't fit the data, you go back and tell them that's a great idea, but that's not something you can do, or that's something that. And yes, there are some areas that I deliberately avoid because I don't want to get into a turf war in different ways. Nevertheless, I had 2 papers accepted in AMJ with 1 reviewer out of 3 telling me that what I was doing was completely the wrong way of studying culture. And when you try to get research on culture published in top journals, often you will find people that have a very different way of looking at culture, understanding culture, and the way culture should be studied. And there seems to be irreconcilable differences there, or there seemed to be back then. Maybe now things are different.
Thank you.
Couple more questions, and when we move on to the final part, Natalia.
Hello. Thanks so much for the session today. It's been great. I was just wondering how you treat literatures in the front end that are relevant to your findings or could help explain your findings, but are not the primary literature you want to contribute to.
So that's a good question. Sometimes you feel the need of having a theoretical lens that you bring in order to explain your findings. And again, that's a matter of what reviewers are comfortable with. I preferably introduce that later in the theorization of the model, not to confuse about what I want to contribute to. Sometimes you need to bring in sense-making theory because you use that as a theoretical lens to theorize, to explain the cognitive processes that behind what you observe. But you don't necessarily want to contribute to sense-making theory per se. But if you put it up front, then reviewers will get back to you and expect you to contribute that too. But then occasionally you will have reviewers that say, well, this is coming out of the blue. You need to introduce it properly in the beginning. So again, the negotiation. It's figuring out what eventually seems to flow better and be more easily understandable. Axel, Susan, and then I think we move on.
Thanks a lot for the great session. I just wanted to ask if you could specify on the boundary conditions in such, would you say you specify the boundary conditions when you define your research questions, or you specify them when you theorize from your data and build your theoretical explanation?
Well, some are implicit in the frame and say this is a study of this. And it's an implicit statement that the statements that you're going to make, the theoretical claims that you're going to make, you think apply within those boundaries to this type of organization, this type of thing, not that. This is about incremental change. It's not about radical change. This is about, I don't know, this is about family business, not public companies. And some are really brought up in the discussion, and those are more about contextual conditions. Very specific characteristic of the setting or specific events that happened that might have influenced the way things unfolded, and say, well, it is possible that part of what I saw was influenced by these particular conditions. Then future research may want to investigate the relationship between this contextual condition and the phenomenon in more depth. So some very idiosyncratic characteristics of the setting that you want to acknowledge and say, look, this is not the archetypal family business or not the archetypal incremental change, something happened in between, and that might be relevant for what I saw. And that usually goes in the discussion.
Thank you.
Susan, and then we move on.
Thank you so much. This is outstanding, and I really appreciate all that you're doing to to work with us. Really been phenomenal, and the timing is perfect. I have a question going back to a couple of questions ago that I want you to expand on. So you spoke a little bit about your framing and your setup and where you want to contribute to, but then you also spoke about the potential of using a different theory as a lens. And so one of my concerns personally as an author and as a reviewer is invoking too many theories. But at the same time, I just snagged a reviewer who really, and it was the way I wrote the paper. It was my fault. But now the reviewer has really latched onto this, the theory that is the lens versus the theory where I want to make a contribution. And so can you also, so can you roughly outline how you manage different theories, right? So how some theories are that which you want to contribute to, and some are that which are the lens. And can you also, if you offer any advice, if you have any, on that, do you always have to follow the reviewer's advice regarding theory, or are you able to push back? Have you ever pushed back successfully?
Yes, on occasions I have. We're going to have a Ibra, so we let them know already that in September we're organizing a special webinar about responding reviewers. Anyway, maybe we'll talk about that then, on that occasion. I think that you always have a focal literature, right? That is tied to what you're trying to explain, a particular outcome, a particular process, it's like something. I mean, even in qualitative research, we always have some sort of dependent variable that we try to explain and we try to understand better. And usually the primary target of our paper is the conversation around that particular process or that particular phenomenon. But then it may be that, just in our case, in order to understand open system orchestrations, we needed a theory of entrepreneurship. It may be that in order to understand strategic change, you need a theory of sense making. You need a theory of the more general cognitive processes, social processes that are taking place that help you explain what you saw. And then how you handle with reviewers that say, well, but now you're expected also to contribute to a theory of sense making, then I think that it may be worth checking with the editor and say, well, do you expect me to do that? What is your view on that? And if the editor says, I think that's a good idea, you should go with it, then probably, unless you have very strong argument, you can say that you can tell the editor, I don't think that's a good idea for these reasons. But if the editor says, well, I think it is, just go that way, then probably you want to go that way. There's only so much you can fight back. Okay, good. Last slide. So now how can you claim, now that you have framed the paper, established the boundaries, theorized, offered an explanation, how can you persuade the reviewers that that explanation that you propose is a significant and novel theoretical contribution? Yep. So the way the last version of the discussion, once we went through it and with a different pair of eyes, and we realized that we were making a lot of mistakes, or like not mistakes, but things that didn't quite help us. First of all, we still had too many references to empirical observations. Now, the discussion is the place where you tell your readers how what you observe is relevant, important, insightful, how it helps further research progress. Is no longer the place where you keep adding, you keep referring to empirical observations. That's the findings. Ideally, you should have told me everything that was relevant to know about your observations back then. Occasionally, you may still refer to it, but there were too many things. We were citing too many different literatures. There was a lack of focus. Like, okay, but this was too much. We're too eclectic there. It's like, okay, what is the target? What is the main conversation you want to do? Too many statements that were not elaborated. And we contribute to this, and we contribute to that, and we have this insight and we have other insight. And this never flies with the top journals. They don't want you to have 9 claim contribution each one paragraph. They want you to have 3 elaborated, well discussed, in depth, 2, 3 big ideas, not 9, 10 things thrown up here and there. Too many claims of similarity. And this is a common mistake when you're a young scholar. You see, like you feel the need to reassure yourself and the reader that, no, believe me, like these ideas are great. And it's not just me saying that, it's also those great guys before me, or it's not just my study, other studies before saw the same thing. And that's the piece of that. No? Because if you keep saying all these findings resonate with prior research that shows that it's consistent with these ideas, our work confirms, it's like, okay, but what is new here? Theoretically, you can point out that empirically there are similarities, but theoretically, your theoretical ideas, they have to be new. Too many new contributions. It was not a big aha. No? They didn't have punch. So, one step back. Why do you get your paper published in top journals? They're published because they provide a theoretical contribution. And if reviewers and the editors are not persuaded that your paper, that your study provides a theoretical contribution, they're not. They will reject your paper. A theoretical contribution, how do you establish if something is a theoretical contribution? You need to connect with an existing literature. So you have to connect to the debate, the conversation. It shouldn't be something free floating. You have to connect with some ideas, assumptions, and challenge partly what we think is true about a certain phenomenon, or what we accept as true about a certain phenomenon. True in brackets. Inverted commas. So you need to connect to a set of assumptions and challenge partly some of these assumptions. Davis, 1971, if you haven't read it, it's a great article. Essentially, Davis tells us that, or that these are his arguments, that theoretical propositions are not paid attention to and cited because they are true, objectively true, but because they are interesting. And what makes a statement interesting? It partly challenges taken for granted beliefs. If you're telling people, you know what, everything you think is true about this, well, it's actually true. They would go like, yeah, duh, this is obvious. We knew about it. So what's new here? Or you know about this thing that you really don't care about, and like that's actually just like, yeah, this may be interesting, but if I don't care about it, then this is the wrong journal. If we try to publish something about a wolf hunting pack in the Academy of Management journal, they would be like, and how does that relate to organizations? How that changes the way we think about organizations? Chances are they would say this is irrelevant. Or if you're telling people, you know, everything you believe is true, it's all wrong. It's all completely wrong. You're completely misguided. We need to have very, very, very strong arguments, very strong data, because otherwise they were like, this is absurd. Come on, this doesn't make any sense. So it has to challenge some weakly held assumptions, to partly challenge, not entirely challenge what we think is true about the thing. And this is what everybody gets from Davis. And you don't need to read the paper probably at this point. But Davis has an interesting part where he gives all examples. The problem with Davis is that 1971 is writing and is giving us examples of types of interesting propositions that and uses like classic sociology of the 50s or 60s, and it's very difficult. So I tried to, for my doctoral students, to translate this. And this is, for instance, it says examples of type of interesting propositions. What seems to be a stable and unchanging phenomenon is really, what seems to be a stable and unchanging phenomenon is really unstable and changing. For instance, organizational identity change. Papers were published because they were saying, well, you know what, we always think about identity as inertial and enduring, but we show that under certain conditions, organizational identities do change. That makes it interesting. Or what seems to be an unstable and changing phenomenon is really stable and unchanging. Isomorphic pressures, institutional theory saying, you know what, we focus on change and adaptation and strategy making and differentiations. Like, actually, there's a lot of pressures for all organizations to behave in the same way, to be structured in the same way. Function. What seems to be a phenomenon that functions ineffectively is really a phenomenon that functions effectively. Argadon and Sutton's beautiful study of brainstorming, saying all this experimental work about brainstorming suggests that it doesn't work. Well, we actually studied an organization that does it really, and we explain why it works and the conditions in which it works. Or what seems to be a phenomenon that functions effectively is in reality a phenomenon that functions ineffectively. All the rhetoric about TQM. So he has 12 types of interesting propositions. There's no time for me to go into all of those. But I think you get the idea. And I think it's very important to think about your findings in these terms and say, how can we present our arguments as people used to think this, well, it's actually that. Other examples, what people assume they are vary together, they don't vary together. Or what people seem to be independent or negatively correlated, they're actually positively correlated. What seems to be a local phenomenon is really general. What seems to be general is really local. I hope you get the idea. This is what makes something interesting, according to Davis. So, when it comes to writing your discussion, I'm almost at the end, is a template. You know, we talked about templates and about the danger of templates. But I think that this template is a good place to start. Because often you're like, what do I write in the discussion section? Well, you can try this way and see if it works. Usually, I start by reminding the question guiding my study and summarizing the observation. First, like the first paragraph of the discussion is like, our study investigates the following question, something like that. You know? Our study investigates whether our findings show that. And just reminding them about the research question and summarizing your findings. Second paragraph, something along the line like, our observations change the way we think about whatever it is we're studying. Now, A and J, they have it in their editorial guidance. They say, we publish research that changes the way we think about organizations. So a very useful exercise that I recommend to every single one of you is to think about your study and say, okay, let's complete this sentence. My study changes the way we think about innovation, female entrepreneurs, whatever it is, because. And if you cannot find a because, you have a problem. Yeah, but you will find something. And that should be the gist of the second paragraph, like this big statement about why your findings as a whole change the way we think about it. And then the rest of the discussion, you focus on 2-3 core insights. And you have one subsection with a subheading. And a subheading somehow tries to capture the content so that it's very clear to the reader that here's what your study was about, here's the big idea, and here are the fundamental contributions with a label that helps you capture the essence of what is the message, what is the statement you make. Then in each subsection, you start with a paragraph that says, past research assumes that, or past theories of identity or theories of innovation assume that, or scholars tend to agree that. Something that in a paragraph summarizes the current assumptions, the assumptions that you want to challenge, that you want to question, that you want to extend. That's the first paragraph. Second paragraph starts by saying, in contrast, our findings indicate that, or unlike this, or like the very first sentence has to signal a difference, a contrast. Like, these are the assumptions that we had before my study. This is how my study suggests something different. And then third paragraph. This, what I've shown, this insight, this revelation that what we thought it was true, it was not entirely true. This is important because when you start talking about the implications for future research, or for a more general theoretical understanding of a concept, whatever it is. And then, finally, this is how you address limitations. And say, well, it could be argued that the limitations of our study was, and honestly present this possible limitation. But right away, you say, well, actually, and then you counter, and you turn it into an opportunity of research. You say, well, this is interesting. This is a reasonable objection. Future research may use this particular method to investigate this. I couldn't do everything myself. No? I mean, in my study, all the studies are limited. And I found this much better than having a limitation section, which is lame because you never know where to put it. If you put the limitations in the end, they tell you that you don't want to end your paper on a sad note. If you put your limitations in the beginning of the discussion, it's like, well, ideally, you should tell your first thing you should tell your readers is how great your study is, not how weak your study is. You put it in the method section, it looks like admitting that your method is flawed. So you never know where to put it, but they want you to put it. And I think that's it. Make a statement of contribution, of past assumptions, in context to show this. This is important because it could be argued that something might have influenced what happened, limitations, and then you present your counter argument and then suggest that future research may investigate that. And it's also useful to integrate better your suggestion for future research into the discussion, because otherwise sometimes it looks a bit disconnected, and you say, this is why it's important, and then future research could do this and this and that. And say, well, why should they do this? Like, just because you say so. But no, actually, you tie future research to limitations of your study. Try it and see if it works. And that doesn't always work. That doesn't always work. But also try to find some cool insights. In this paper, you go there, we had this. As a result of these processes, the network examined was simultaneously business-oriented and community-oriented, was diverse but homogeneous, was open and closed, was giving freedom but close monitoring. Yeah? And this is that there was a bit of a paradox, and reviewers like this. They want to see tensions, they want to see dynamism, they want to see paradox. That's what makes it interesting. So try to think about this possible, and this was not obvious in the beginning. It's something that came up as we engaged a little more with the literature, and that gave us a better awareness of the data. And this is something that allows you to somehow support the big aha. And I'm almost there. Don't. So things that you shouldn't do. As we said, don't search for reassurance in highlighting how your observations confirms, resonate. Don't. You have to highlight difference. In contrast, our study shows. Unlike past research, our study shows. Don't give past studies more credit than they deserve. That's another common mistake. Somehow projecting what you saw into prior research and saying, well, it's consistent with, and sometimes they didn't say that. They didn't say that. They didn't say that explicitly. They didn't say it. So don't give past research more than they deserve. An honest portrayal of what you really know, what was really said by prior scholars, and then position yourself. This is a common mistake. Don't formulate the research questions in terms of your observation. It is normal, I do it all the time, that you reformulate the research questions at the end of the study. But you can see that this wasn't really the question driving the study. You're just like, our study investigate whether it's possible that something happens, and we show that happens. It's like, yeah, of course, you saw it happening. So, but that don't confuse the question with the answer. Okay, there's a question, and then you provide the answer. But what is the question to that answer? And don't give away your key insights by incorporating them in the framing. It's like, oh, this is the big aha, and we want to study how this big aha happens. Like, oh, but that was just the fact that it happens. It's something that's the answer to a question. That's the thing that makes it interesting. So again, I don't have anything better than this, but as a reader, I can tell when the authors have done this and when they really take the answer and they put it in the question. And try not to do that. There's a question and there's an answer in the previous. Don't mix the framing with the contribution. The framing is what motivates the research question. The contribution is the answer and why the answer is novel and interesting. Common mistake, as I was saying, is starting with a very general question. That's what I do most of the time. I find a case that seems to be very interesting and I have a general question. Then you notice something that is unusual or some interesting patterns, and then you retrofit the question. And so we investigated the role of this, or we know much about this, but this other thing is understudied. That's why we studied that. That's kind of weak. Try always to frame things in terms of broader tensions, issues, problems that your study was somehow selected to examine better, or that represented an ideal setting for investigating. That's not the only way to properly frame a puzzle, but Esther Zuckerman has a great small text about different ways to frame a puzzle. So I think it's still available in his managed website. Finally, don't confuse the framing with discussion items. Framing is what justified the study in the first place, the puzzle you want to solve, the problem you address. Discussion items are secondary contributions to other literatures. And this is interesting too, but this is not what motivated the study in the first place. This is not the main answer to the question. Framing is about what motivates the question and the primary audience. Then there are discussion items that can enrich your discussion and highlighting how your answers are interesting, possibly to other audiences, but keep the two things separate. The introduction should have a clear framing with a clear primary target, and then the discussion will introduce other interesting insights. But I think that's all I've got for the day. And happy at this point to take questions. Banjan. Banjan? No. Yes. Hello? We can't hear you. Or at least I can't. Shall we move on to a different?
Hello?
Oh, hi, there you are.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm so sorry. Something went wrong. I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. Once again, I was captivated the whole time, and I'll be listening to this again and again. Davide, I have a question regarding the contribution.
Yes.
I have been researching the social entrepreneurship phenomena, and let's say I have a research question, which is like, how is it that social entrepreneurs, how do they practice ethics when they're working close to the ground? And for my study, I find some interesting social bricolage, and I have a case study research. But in my contribution, I see that I'm coming up with findings which contribute to social entrepreneurship literature and ethics literature. However, is it necessary that I have to contribute to bricolage? And if I can't, is it that I should not make the argument in the first place that my research, to find an answer to my research question, I would...
That's something that I cannot tell you. It's not necessary, and you have to figure out if your findings can be interesting for that conversation on bricolage. My reaction to the framing you propose is, why do we need, why is it surprising that they enact ethical practices on the ground if it's social entrepreneurs? Why shouldn't they? So you see what I mean? I would expect you to highlight a puzzle there that allows you then to theorize later and say, well, social entrepreneurship, it's all good, but we know that in practice, entrepreneurs need to make some decisions that have to ensure the, I don't know, the business sustainability, the viability, the economic viability of the venture, and that may contradict some of their ethical values. So how do they handle that? Now you see that if you frame it this way, and maybe you do frame it that way already in your paper, that say, okay, how do they handle that contradiction or those tensions?
Okay.
Mamore. You're muted. You are still muted.
I have to unmute myself.
Okay, yes, now we can hear you. Please.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof, for such a wonderful presentation. It was very informative and helpful. I'm a PhD student, actually calling from Cape Town, South Africa, at the UCT Graduate School of Business. So I have just one question. I'm actually looking at how entrepreneurial motivation and attitude influence sustainable supply chain performance in their value chain. So the question would be, what would you recommend is the maximum number of theories that one could borrow to locate his or her own research?
So reviewers, the recommendation is not to bring in more than a couple of theories, because as scholars, we are perfectly able to juggle 3, 4, or 5 theories. When we turn into reviewers, it seems that our cognitive capacity shrinks, and then we are unable to handle more than a couple of theories at the same time. But there's a good reason. Ideally, you may want to have one theory that is what you want to contribute to, and you may have another theory that is the lens that you use in order to theorize your data. Adding more theories, maybe you can have again, it depends what is a theory. We're talking about big theories or about theoretical constructs. When it comes to theoretical constructs, I think we can handle 3, 4 large constructs sometimes. But not all. Like I've been, in a particular case, I fought with reviewers to keep in one construct that was really dear to me and important to explain, and there was nothing to. In the end, I had to drop it. There was too much resistance to keep that construct in, and they wanted a cleaner story, no more than 2 big ideas. That's a shame. I thought that, but maybe my fault. I wasn't able to explain it properly.
Okay, thank you so much for the insights. Yes, I do appreciate that. I think it just came from an appreciation that normally, in as much as I'm looking at how the motivation would influence the sustainable supply chain performance practices, but there are also certain, perhaps mitigating factors that pushes them to at least begin to adopt, no matter how little on the progress, things like your institutional theory that informs how, authorities or maybe standards that are applicable in in supply chain that would enforce adoption of, sustainability, or maybe stakeholders that could also push more into ensuring that this business is really taken into consideration, either employees or communities around in which they do businesses, and how that may affect.
I cannot really comment on that because it's really not my field, but I think that something that just came to mind, Marianne Lewis, to give a presentation, she had this very good idea and said, well, paper cannot be about too many things. I think ideally a paper can be about 2 or 3 things, and one has to be figure, and the other one or the 2 other ones have to be ground, and you have to decide what is figure and what is ground, and that somehow shapes the primary audience that you will address. And if your paper is about too many things, it may become confusing. So try to think about your paper in these terms. what is the main thing that I want to explain, and what helps me define the context within which this thing happened, the particular context, or the particular angle that I will use to explain this.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Hi, David. Thanks again for another very insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it opened my mind in several areas. What I have question is more on the upfront of your presentation about problematizing. Attention that I see, at least I have in the paper that I'm working on, is some organizational identity change close to your, specifically some of your works as well. And that I feel that when I want to go down and say that this is what has not been done, it becomes so small thing that I have difficulty then arguing why is it important. For example, saying that the organizational change in identity happens in labels, in meanings, but also there is probably a third dimension and so forth. I feel that then I'm going too narrow. What should I do for saying that this is really important and paying attention? It's not a narrow problematization. I appreciate if you have thoughts on that.
I don't know. Sometimes some fields become too saturated. There are fields where these days it's very difficult to say anything interesting and new without splitting hair, because there's been a lot of research. And perhaps one should consider an alternative framing and maybe a different, different literature to contribute. Many studies lend themselves to different, you can frame this way or the other way, and sometimes your initial framing would take you into a very crowded space where it is difficult to carve out a space for contribution, while a different framing may bring you into a very empty new space where it's easier to say interesting, novel and interesting things. It may not be your case. Maybe you have very interesting stuff about identity change that I don't know. But if you think that you find it difficult to say anything new because you can explain most of what you saw based on what you already have, then maybe you can consider other framings.
It's less of a explaining with the existing theory what happened, but it can be the scenario is so specific and narrow that makes less number of people interested in it.
The only thing is to try. Present your work in symposia, workshops, tracks where the community will be there, and emphasize the empirical part. And they will let you know, like, well, the current framing you have is a bit narrow, but this is interesting. Actually, you should emphasize this part, and maybe you will get to it. What we do is really a collective endeavor. And presenting your work to people that are in a position to give you comments is often very useful.
Thanks so much.
No problem. Sam. You're muted.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for very practical insight. I really like the part when you talk about step-by-step guide to how to structure a discussion section. And then also previously, you also mentioned that we should also resonate our finding with prior study, although not overdo it. So in what part of the paper where we connect to prior study to sort of confirm or consistent with their finding, and then do the contrasting or counterintuitive insight part? Thank you very much.
So I didn't get the question, sorry.
The question is, where do we, if the discussion is the part where we talk about the counterintuitive and the contribution, where do we talk about the resonation with prior study or partially?
It could be in when you theorize your method. If you look at this paper, I think we did it in the theorization of the method, the theorization of the model. So the way I do things, I usually have methods, findings, and that is something that can be the end of the findings, the beginning of the discussion, or an intermediate section, where it's like a grounded model of. And that's where you theorize the model, where you explain, when you articulate the mechanisms. And that may be where you can bring in other studies and show that what you saw is corroborated. Or it could be in the beginning of the discussion, say, this is what we wanted to know, this is the question we asked, these are our findings, and that's where you also say, these findings can be used to also can be applied to prior research, or depending on how you want to use this corroboration. If it's like showing how past empirical observations are similar to yours, or showing how your new theoretical ideas help explain prior studies. I think if you have a look at some of the papers that I mentioned, you will see. If you go back to the paper, you will find it, and you will see how we use it again. And in the main paper, I think we did this in the model, the theory, grounded theory, grounded model section. But in most other papers, we did it in the discussion, in the beginning of the discussion. No problem. Raul? We can't hear you.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, once again, I mean, it was really an amazing session. I just wish that I had you as my professor full time. So it was simply amazing. So I just get straight.
Where are you? Where are you based? Hawaii?
I'm from India. I'm from India. So I'm from this place called Indian Institute of Management, Trichy. IIM for short. Indian Institute of Management. That's what it's called. So I've been to the.
I was once in Bangalore.
Oh, right. Okay, that's great.
Yeah,
Trichy and Bangalore quite close by. Yeah.
Okay, let's not bore the rest of you. Please.
Yeah, right. So so I had this question around the part where you connected Davis's paper. That's interesting, yes. 1971.
Yes.
And then you said that we have to challenge certain assumptions, but then of course you don't go overboard. But then you look at certain assumptions which are weakly stated, and then you kind of target that. But then I was just wondering, when you look at the concept of organizational identity, which was established 1985, Albert and Wetton, where you're saying that it is central, distinctive, and enduring. And then, when I look at your paper, your work, which says that no, especially when you talked about the stabilization part of it, where you said that identity, organizational identity, actually is something which can change, and it's not something which is stable. Now, for me, that looks like you're trying to change the entire conversation of the literature. I mean, it was not just an incremental addition. It's more of a radical addition, if I have to. That's what I felt, at least. And so I was just thinking, like, when you do something of that sort, two things which I was thinking. One is, like, how do you kind of convince the people on the other side that this is something which is possible? That's one thing. That's one question. The other sub question is, how did you even figure out that this is an assumption that I can target? I mean, was it something which you found intuitively, or was it something which you found as you read the literature, or was it something which you found empirically as you kind of processed your data and it came emergent? So especially because you talked about transferability and generalizability, I think that's a central theme in your entire presentation. So I was just wondering how all this connects. And I know it's a bit of a long question, but I had to ask it.
No. So I think that first of all, if you look at the literature on identity, you will notice that I arrived relatively late in the chain, in the sense that already Albert and Wetton in 1985 they define it as enduring, but they say on occasions it may change on certain salient moments. Then Dennis Joya, Michael Schultz, and Kevin Corley, 2000, they say actually it changes more often than we think, because we don't see change in the labels, but there may be change in the meanings. So by the time my papers arrived, the community was ready to accept that, to accept a more explicit. And it was 2004. There was Dennis Joya showing that actually sometimes it can change radically, or it may be questioned. So the only paper that I can really think of as radically clashing with all the assumptions that we had there were few of them. One example is Hannan and Freeman, the paper that 1977 that started the whole population ecology. It was saying, well, it's not a competition. Surviving the competition is not a matter of strategizing, adapting. No, it's the environment that selects. Like all the strategy stuff is rubbish. There's an environment that selects, and that's how it works. And I'm not sure a paper like that would be accepted today. I think that in the 1960s and 70s, people enjoyed more latitude. If they have some very clever ideas, they were very interesting, which brings us back to Davis's statement about, doesn't matter if it's true, what matters is that it's interesting. And which also isomorphic pressure, the idea that, look, it's all about, all the conversation is about differences and change, and no, actually most of the organizations are more similar than we think.
Hi, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I actually learned a lot, and you have said something about interesting proposition, and actually see that you shared an example, isomorphic pressure on organizational choice, which is also related to my own research. Yeah, my research is based on neo-institutional theory, and aim to explore that performance management in Chinese multinational enterprises in their subsidiary located in other developing countries. So based on the neo-institutional theory, so they might be both implied, the organization comply to the institutions because of the isomorphic pressures, and the organization and the managers can also be active and can shape the local institutions. This is my the framing. But when I finish,
this seems to be your answer. This seems to be what you observe.
Yes, but
so the question is, what is the question?
The question is how the performance management conduct in this research setting. It's like how institutions impact performance management. Yes.
Then you have to argue, like, why would you expect institutions to impact performance management differently than the way in which institutions work normally?
Because I joined from the neo-institutional theory, and it said that the organization can be negatively impacted and also can be the active role. But when I analyzed the data that are collected, I realized that the organizations just comply to the institutions, which is not that interesting, maybe.
Yes, that's what the general theory would say, that organizations comply.
Yes.
If they can decouple, they decouple. If they cannot, and strong institutional pressures, one of the things they can do is comply.
Yeah, so is there anything that to maybe improve the research, or it's just not that interesting? I need to maybe find another gap or collect more data.
The question is, sometimes you do observe something that is exactly what the theory says, but then you could still present it as interesting if you have arguments like, yeah, but in this specific setting, you wouldn't expect that. There are good reasons to believe that these organizations wouldn't comply. So why do they comply? Compliance is just one of the many ways in which organizations may respond to institutional pressure.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is your case, but if under these conditions we would expect them to comply and they do comply, then it's not. You say, look, if we look at these organizations, based on what we know about institutions and organizations, they shouldn't comply.
Yeah.
Why do they comply? Then that would maybe.
Yeah, it means find another interesting angle to analyze the case. Thank you so much.
No problem. So it's all about, like, why is this surprising?
Yeah.
Maybe it's surprising because it happens as predicted by the general theory, but in a place where it shouldn't happen. Ravika.
Oh, hi.
Yes.
I come back again. I want to ask, when I theorized and I come up with a framework, I find that my frameworks quite similar to the other people framework, but it's not the one that I contributed into. It's not the theory that I contributed into, but it's come from somewhere else.
Okay.
My question is, should I say that, okay, my framework quite similar to those guys' framework, but in different contexts and different theories?
But if it's a different context and it's a different theory, how can it be similar?
Because I contributed into response capability in supply chain, but that one is from information technology in crisis management, with the main audience is for public people, public practitioner.
It may be that they're similar because there are some fundamental social, cognitive, economic forces that are at play in both circumstances. But I would say, if this is not something that your main audience is likely to know, if it's not part of that conversation, it's not likely to, just because they saw something vaguely similar in an entirely different setting, that may not necessarily mean that your study is not novel. There's what makes a finding novel is that you connect with the assumptions of a particular community. You challenge those assumptions, you extend those assumptions, you help them enrich their conversation. And if something kind of similar was said by somebody else 3 years ago in a completely unrelated conversation, then maybe you may use that to corroborate your ideas, or just maybe let it go. And may not be relevant.
Okay, so it's not necessary to refer to those literature.
I cannot give you a definitive answer because I don't know. I don't have the elements to say, no, you shouldn't do it, or you should absolutely bring it in. I'm saying, but it's not something that is related, really, that is likely to be considered part of this conversation, or that people would say, oh, but what about that? It may not be relevant.
But if I incorporate that conversation, yeah, is it something that I contribute into their research, or it's not about that? It's not.
Try to avoid that. Like, stick to your primary audience. Or maybe you realize that your study is interesting for this other community, and then you write a paper addressing these other communities.
Okay. And another thing is my framework, because I developed my framework from the empirical data. So the empirical data tell me it's a kind of mixture between causality and process. Like A leads to B at the same time. A may come first and B may come later. So is it possible to mix between process framework and causality framework, or should not prefer?
It is possible. Whether it's supported by the data, that I don't know, but it is possible to have a model that says, depending on certain conditions, your process will unfold in one way or another. So anything is possible as long as you have data that supported reasoning.
Yeah, but if I don't specific or say or claiming about my framework is process framework or causality framework, I just say that I develop the framework from empirical data. Is it all right? Yeah.
Okay.
you.
Clive, and then probably we have a lot of questions from the, after Clive, we look at the chat, because there may be a lot of questions there.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. I'm a PhD student, University of Cape Town, South Africa, but based in Johannesburg. I've got a question where it's to do with having a novel situation and significance. So I've done a pilot a few years ago on 3 entrepreneurs, and I studied them, and I found that having a C-suite engagement with them at a senior management level, I've seen an impact over a period of 9 months on their job creation and their change in mindset. Now I'm wanting to do this in a much bigger situation with a case study in a large industrial company, which is listed, and it's a program that I'm implementing and driving. The question I have is, and this is about senior executive engagement with entrepreneurs or SMMEs, and to see the impact of that change in the program and exactly how they, regarding job creation potential, change in mindset and motivation. The question I have is, firstly, the novel and significant aspect comes to mind. And the second one is, because I'm very much involved in driving that program, am I too close to the situation that will drive a particular result?
I don't know. It's hard to comment on very specific projects. So I would suggest to do a partner with a more experienced colleague that may be given an outsider perspective, may help you see things from a broader theoretical perspective. So
okay.
Ibrat, Sergey, do we have some questions from the chat?
Yeah, we have one question from Arwa. She's asking, what is your advice on the best way to theorize the arrows to support theoretical contribution?
Just do it. You have to explain. So you haven't, when you connect two constructs with an arrow in your figure, intuitively you are assuming that there's a connection between those two constructs. Maybe causal, maybe sequential, maybe reciprocal influence, whatever, depending on the kind of arrow that you use. So try to write it down. Like, what's happening there? Why is it happening? This is what theorizing the arrow is about. It's really writing a sentence or two, a paragraph, for every single arrow, explaining what that arrow means to you, why you felt the need to draw an arrow there. I think it's as simple as that. And it has to be a theoretical explanation using the present tense, not the past tense. Past tense is a description, then you're describing what happened. I don't know if that verifies or helps. Verifies, maybe not, but helps.
There's one more question on the YouTube, Davide. What is your view on theoretical bricolage or developing framing that fits to the data?
Theoretical bricolage, meaning, the risk is that the risk is doing what I told you in the beginning that you shouldn't do. So the idea is not using well-established theories to explain a particular event or a particular set of empirical observations. So if theoretical bricolage is, I'm borrowing from various theories so that I have the most accurate explanation of why what I saw happening happened, then you're using what we know to explain a specific case, while what journals expect from you is to use a specific case to enrich what we know. But I don't know if that's what you have in mind when you ask about theoretical bricolage. Ankita, there's a question.
Professor Ravasi, so if I may interest you in one of my papers, so there is a
You may
paper
be interested, but the rest of the community may not be interested. So
yeah.
I would say it's if your question can stimulate a more general conversation, it is about a more general topic, that's fine. But otherwise, also it may be difficult for me to comment on something.
Absolutely. So actually the question is around the contribution part of my paper. So I'll have to explain a little bit about the paper, and probably you may be able to reflect, give some insights into that. So there's a study which I have done on organizational learning in social enterprises. And one of the papers that I'm developing is on knowledge brokering in the context of social enterprises. So there's a specific model that has come up with immersion and the specific conditions why certain people play certain brokering roles, and it's a collective process, right? Now, I'm not very sure. So there are two kinds of literature where I'm actually, the paper potentially contributes to. One is the knowledge brokering literature, where it's kind of specifying the conditions, the role of immersion, and the collective aspect of brokering. Otherwise, generally it's looked at, and it's an organizational level work, so it's not a network based work. And on the other hand, in the social enterprise context, there is hardly any work on knowledge brokering and these kind of aspects. So I am not very sure. I'm not sure if how clear I am in explaining this to you.
So
whether it's a narrow contribution or a broad contribution, that is where my question actually lies.
So I think it's an example of what I told you earlier, about the difference between a contribution and a discussion item. So the framing and a discussion item. Knowledge brokering is a broad concept.
Right.
And it may be that studying social enterprises, you're looking at knowledge brokering in a very specific setting. If you have a framing around knowledge brokering, then reviewers may go back to you and say, well, if you're interested in knowledge brokering, why did you study it in social enterprises? What makes that an ideal setting to study knowledge brokering?
Right.
But if you start with the say, well, this is a study of social enterprise, and then you claim, you make a credible claim that knowledge brokering is something that is relevant to social enterprise and you don't know much about it, that could be a more realistic framing. And then in the discussion section, after having discussed how your findings answer your questions, you can say, and in addition, my study also contributes to research on knowledge brokering by showing this. That's a discussion item. It's something that, look, this is not why I chose this setting in the first place. It was not the research, like my primary ambition was not to contribute to this conversation, but I realized that I've seen something that may be of interest to this point, like a secondary thing.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for this insight.
No problem.
Davide, perhaps one last question?
Yes.
If that's okay. And this is going back to the discussion on bricolage.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to kind of get my head around it. So if we brought two theories together, let's say sense making and institutional theory.
Yes.
And we're trying to, perhaps in the first instance, we want to use sense making to explain, maybe therefore sense making less to explain institutional change. Are we effectively then contributing to the institutional change discussions by bringing a lens?
So again, to me, the contribution is usually should be anchored in what you are trying to explain, and that's the primary conversation. If you want to understand, better institutional change, that's your primary conversation. That's your you're talking to institutional theories that want to understand institutional change, and you will tell them that, look, by using sense-making theory, my study used sense-making theory to understand the cognitive, to unpack the cognitive underpinnings of institutional change. Something like that. This doesn't mean that you have the ambition also to contribute to sense-making theory.
Do you say it does or it doesn't?
It doesn't. Like you may, but it doesn't necessarily mean it. Well, alternatively, you could say, well, I'm using institutional theory to understand better the conditions under which sense-making takes place. Research on sense-making has overlooked the fact that most of the time our interpretive process takes place within culture and institution, which is not true, which is like I acknowledge that. So, but let's assume that it didn't. You could either use institutional theory to explain sense-making or use sense-making to explain institutional theory. I would keep it simple and write a paper that it's either addressing institutional theorists or sense-making scholars. A paper that says, I'm going to tell you how institutional theory can be illuminated by the use of sense-making and vice versa, how bringing this will also help. It's a lot to process, and it's a lot to show empirically. So you may have papers where you are able to do that, but ideally you may want to be simple. But anything is possible if you're able to pull it off.
And if you end up theorizing something new about sense-making itself, are you then putting the institutional change into the background?
We're talking about a theory paper, though, huh? That's a different story.
No. It's empirical.
Can you rewrite it as a sense-making paper?
And institutional change becomes the context.
And institutional change becomes the contour, or you have to figure out what is more interesting: is the institutional change part or the sense-making part? I mean, what is figure and what is ground? Maybe it's both, but it's more difficult to.
Okay, so it's a case of judgment and framing. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Davide. I think we can call it a day. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for all your questions and comments. And thank you very much, Davide. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, Brad and Sergey, for organizing this again.